First item today, we have the pleasure of having the Honorable Delegate Glenn R. Davis, the 84th District General Assembly here, and Warren Harris, the Director of Economic Development, to discuss cannabis oil legislation and development opportunities.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of council. Yes, today, pleased to have Delegate Davis here with us with regard to the presentation. He was a principal patron and successfully went through the General Assembly. And today is to give you a backdrop of that legislation and its effects or requirements on the local level in terms of what it means in regard to any potential city council action. Let's see if I can advance. Just again, as a bit of a backdrop, the Virginia medical marijuana law comprised of two bills, a House Bill 1251, Senate Bill 726, unanimously passed this past year in both the House and the Senate. The governor signed into law in March and in April, expanding what is considered to be this affirmative defense for possession of cannabis oils that have been determined effective in the diagnosis, in the use of various treatment for pain and issues with various chronic injuries. The change in law does not legalize the possession. That needs to be made clear. It does provide for this affirmative defense. In other words, it allows the patient or the caregiver to have a signed certificate if they're ever stopped by law enforcement or in the court of law as their legal defense for the possession of the oil. And again, this affirmative defense certificate has been significantly updated and is reflected now in the current law that was passed this past General Assembly session. Physicians that are licensed to practice in the Commonwealth of Virginia can sign the affirmative defense certificate. Again, in the literature and in the health profession, there has been a number of emerging applications for the use of cannabis oils for various physical conditions there in the body, and this law, the benefits of cannabis oil production, really now allows individuals with various conditions and illnesses to have a certain level of alleviation of pain, and in some cases have the benefits of even affecting the overprescription and overuse of addictive drugs like opioids, and possibly there is a glimmer of hope to at least stem that tide of the opioid epidemic. It's considered highly safe and highly regulated. What has occurred in this legislation has been for Virginia to have 5 licensed providers throughout the state. Virginia can certainly have the ability to stay here now with their families as opposed to potentially having to go to other states to utilize or seek treatment through medical marijuana therapies. There have been, and there's probably no doubt in anyone's mind here, an interest from various local business groups. Those groups and becoming licensed providers will be called or be referred to as pharmaceutical processors, and to be determined, of course, subject to real estate and investment, certainly a capital investment and local job opportunities derived from the facility. Once again, the idea of medical cannabis oil and the 5 providers that will be identified throughout the state will be referred to as healthcare service areas. They have the ability as a healthcare service provider to grow, extract, dispense, and deliver on site the medical cannabis oil treatment. These licensed providers, once again, are called pharmaceutical processors. In the code, they're vertically integrated, meaning that, as I mentioned, all stages or phases of that process needs to be on one site by one provider. once a license is provided or awarded to a pharmaceutical processor, the facility has 1 year in which to become operational. And then, of course, once they're operational, patients have to register with the program and then be able to fill their recommendation at one of these 5 facilities that will be granted within the state. What happens next? Well, certainly doctors in the medical profession will be required to gain some continuing medical educational credits with regard to medical cannabis oil in order to be a preferred or recommended provider of the cannabis to their to their patients. There are additional registration fees associated with this with regard to the patient and the physician. Now, so where it comes to the local level in this regard, in consultation with the zoning administrator and planning department, it has been determined that in I-1 industrial zoned properties or sites, the sales component and the manufacturing and the distribution of that can occur without any form of conditional use permit or, in other words, any council action. That is subject to the fact, though, if, in fact, that the overall facility, in terms of the size of the retail or the delivery, is no more than 10% of the overall square footage of the facility. If it exceeds that, of course, then, of course, there will be city council action necessary. Also, the city attorney's office has determined, again, that there are no existing code modifications that are necessary or required, thus the action by the city, by the state. Current status, we know to date, because the filing deadline has come and gone, there are now 49 applications that have been filed for consideration. A breakdown of that includes 15 applications that have come out of the Hampton Roads region, 7 out of Richmond, Northern Virginia, 9 out of Richmond, 7 out of Northern Virginia, and 18 from the south side or southwest portion of the Commonwealth. Within that application, there has been a filing fee of $10,000 by the applicant. The approving body that will grant these applications will be out of the Board of Pharmacy. There's an expectation that they will make their decisions by the 14th of August, and then final decisions are expected during the September time period of this year. So with that as a bit of a backdrop, I would like to invite Delegate Davis to the podium and to also expand on this matter.
Welcome, sir.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Mayor. So this is what it looks like on this side. Okay. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here and kind of share where we are in the process. I thought I would kind of give you a brief overview of the rationale of the legislation, a little bit more of the application process, awards and regulations that you're going to see pop up, an overview of what the product is and is not, and then some stuff we put in place to prevent the abuse of the product and of this medicine. I would imagine, especially once it gets announced that who will be actually providing the facility here in the 5th geographic territory, which is what Virginia Beach is in, you'll probably get a number of questions yourself. So hopefully this kind of helps you provide those answers. Where this kind of came from over the last few years, the use of CBD oil has been legal in the Commonwealth of Virginia through affirmative defense, but only when prescribed by a neurologist and only for the purpose of epilepsy. And when I say it's been approved, obviously you could not get it here. So essentially it's if someone were somehow to be in possession of it, they would have the affirmative defense for it. But obviously it was something that has not been able to be manufactured here until this legislation. This then basically expounds upon that legislation and does 2 things. The first thing it does is it expands it beyond just neurologists that can prescribe it. So now any medical doctor can prescribe it, not just neurologists. And for any medical condition they deem appropriate, not just for epilepsy. And then this legislation went on to create the framework that the oil can be produced and provided in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that's really what took place in the 18th session. As you heard, the award date, the final award date, is expected to be on September 25th or thereabouts for these 5 geographic areas. Our area actually goes from the water here in Virginia Beach all the way to Williamsburg. It includes the Middle Peninsula as well as all of the northern neck. So it's a rather large geographic area. There, like you heard, a total of 53 total applications statewide. 2 were deemed, well, actually initially 4 were deemed incomplete, then 2 were accepted, and so now it's just a total of 51 that are actually across the state, 15 of which were here in the Hampton Roads area. There's no limit on the size of the growing facilities at all, but as you'd expect, they're indoor facilities. If you've seen what has transpired in Colorado, this is not the industrial hemp that you may see being grown in a farm. It is inside of these huge facilities where it is a lot of science. The only regulations the state has really put on this is they have to be grown and the dispensary has to be on the same property. They cannot ship any of their product, whether it be in the Commonwealth or outside the Commonwealth. So it's one location that will grow it and also dispense it. And as you heard, localities have control over all zoning requirements and regulations related to this. The first prescription fulfillment, when this becomes available, has to be in person. So this is what gets interesting. I won't say that 5 licenses were arbitrary, but essentially they broke the Commonwealth into 5 areas, and we put in Virginia code that there'll be 1 license per area. But as this continues to progress, the General Assembly may deem it appropriate to have more than just 5. As you can imagine, some people afflicted with certain diseases may have trouble getting fulfillment of these prescriptions, being that there are only 5 in the whole Commonwealth and the size of some of these geographic areas. The first one, like I said, has to be in person. All the other fulfillments on your certificate can be via delivery service. That is not mail. That's not shipping. These facilities do have the ability to have a delivery driver drive and provide those prescriptions after the first during the term of your certificate of affirmative defense. Those affirmative defense certificates can only last up to a maximum of 1 year, but they can be shorter at the discretion of your doctor. The licenses, as you heard, 5 licenses. Everyone that filed paid $10,000 of an application fee. There's a $60,000 award fee and a $10,000 renewal fee every year for the renewal of those licenses by the processors. The reason why that's important is the department is a non-general fund agency, so anything they do, they have to cover their own costs, and those costs are used to cover the costs with staffing and hiring to oversee the regulations of CBD oil. So the reason why I throw that out there is the $10,000 renewals could go up if needed. And the reason why this is so encompassing is, as you've heard, anyone that comes in contact with the CBD oil has to register. So any doctor that wants to prescribe CBD oil has to register with the department. Anyone dispensing the CBD oil for a dispensary has to register. Any patient or patient's guardian has to register. So essentially, anyone that's going to come in contact with this has to be registered with the department. And each oil product has to be registered with the prescription monitoring service. Keep in mind, these are not FDA-approved drugs at this point, so it's going to be up to that department to literally come up with their unique product numbers and oversee the tracking of any type of reporting of negative impacts and that sort of thing on these products. So every individual product will have its own code and will be overseen. What's interesting and what's in front of the Attorney General's office right now with the whole idea of a product is, in the language, the dispensary can only dispense CBD oil. And if you paid attention to what's been going on in the rest of the country, it's not just oil that people have been utilizing and dropping on their tongues, but gummies and vapors and other scenarios. So this law does not allow the smoking of any plant, but there's some, I guess, a debatability of whether it allows that you have to get a vial of oil or whether it can be, let's say, gummies that have the oil already as part of it. And that's what's going through the Attorney General's office right now for rulings. You may see also CBD oil in some retail stores, actually inside the city of Virginia Beach. I found out a couple days ago already. That is not the CBD oil we're talking about here. That is CBD oil from industrial hemp. The difference is CBD oil that we're talking about with this regulation can have up to 5% THC. Industrial hemp CBD oil has less than 0.03% THC. In comparison purposes, typically marijuana is 17 to 20% THC. There is some concern whether the sale of industrial hemp CBD in Virginia is legal at this point, and the Attorney General probably will be rolling on that here shortly. But right now, the Commonwealth has not delineated truly between industrial hemp CBD and this higher grade THC CBD. What we've essentially done is allowed for the use of CBD oil without the high that you would typically hear about from marijuana or the hallucinogenic properties. And it is very tightly regulated to prevent abuse. So, for example, unlike in Colorado, you may have heard stories where you could walk in to see a doctor and the doctor would say, you know, you've got a backache, and you say, yep, I got a backache, and then he writes you a prescription, you go to the other side of the office, and then you get your product dispensed to you. On these facilities, there is not allowed to be a doctor. So you will not you cannot go to one of these locations, see a doctor, and walk around the corner and actually get dispensed CBD oil. Additionally, no prescribing doctor is allowed, or their family, or their employees are allowed to have any financial interest or benefit from a processor or the prescription of CBD oil. So what we've tried to do in Virginia is really cut those ties that you kind of hear about a long time ago and ensure that there is no opportunity for abuse with regards to this product. It is not the high levels of THC that you may hear about from states like Oregon. This literally is limited to 5% THC and less. There still is an ability, as existed in the status quo, for people to possess CBD oil that is not manufactured in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Remember, I mentioned the affirmative defense has already been in place for those with epilepsy, but they couldn't buy that in Virginia. It was only if they happened to be in possession of it through other means. They can still acquire, if they're able to, possess CBD oil from other states, but it has to meet the definition of CBD oil in Virginia, which means it's maxed out at 5% CBD, 5% THC, and a minimum amount of cannabinoid as well. I believe that's 15% cannabinoid that it has to have in there. And then, as you heard from Warren, regardless of what is said here and stuff, the possession of CBD oil in Virginia is not legal. It is just that there's an affirmative defense for the possession of it if he should be found in possession through law enforcement officers. So that's the overview, and if you have questions for Warren and I, happy to take any.
Anybody have any questions for Clint? Sounds like you did a good, Shannon.
I do. So what's the, I don't even know what word I'm looking for, between the oil and the gummy bears? What's up with further discussion about that, and why create the gummy bears? And
So there are different methods, and there's discussion of which is the best way to, the most effective way of taking CBD oil. And if you have a child afflicted with certain things, or certain diseases, maybe they're not going to put a thing of oil on their tongue and gummies. But because the legislation says it allows for the dispensing of CBD oil, it may not allow for any other form except for oil.
Anybody else? Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you coming down and filling us in on this.
I appreciate the opportunity. Great to see everyone again.
Thanks.
Next item is our continuing discussion of short-term rentals. And Jim says it's a never-ending discussion, but we have a number of issues still in regards to short-term rentals that we need to resolve. And Would you like to make a statement or anything, Mr. City Attorney?
I will only say, Mr. Mayor, that I put a letter in the public package this week that I hope everyone had a chance to review. And I hope that I fairly captured where you stood at the end of your workshop on the 26th. I have tried, to the extent that it is helpful, to identify the issues where you may still want to provide additional direction to us in order for us to begin drafting, I think, versions 6, 7, maybe 8 of this. But I'm here to provide any assistance, and Kay is here to provide any assistance we can as you go through this list.
Thank you. The first group of questions that we have is the question of overlay districts and whether or not we want to have the overlay districts and where we want to have the overlay districts. So what I'm going to do is similar to what we did last week, is go down this list and see where everybody stands and see if we can't get some determination. So the first question is, should short-term rentals be permitted as a use in the North End overlay district? And Ben?
I think in the overlay district, yeah, that's the purpose of the overlay district is, yes.
Okay. John?
Acknowledging that there could be more than one overlay district in the north end and with different regulations, yes.
All right. Bob?
I agree with John.
All right. Barbara?
My answer is going to be the same for all of these. I think for any overlay district to be established, additionally, we have to have some process that allows the community to ask for it. And I don't think we have that process yet.
All right. I'm yes. Jim?
Yes.
Yes.
Rosemary? All right. John?
I'm yes too, but I'm with Barbara. I mean, we've got to come up with not just defining whether it's appropriate for that neighborhood, but how do you define the boundary of that? And so that's what I'm wrestling with. So I'm yes with all of these within the stipulation of how do you define whether it's appropriate for the community and how do you define what those boundaries are.
We can get to that later.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sort of is my question, though. Are we saying yes to these definitively? Yes, they've got an overlay district, or?
I was saying yes along your terms.
Yes, conditionally to what we're gonna get to, because I'm not going to
So
say
we-
yes.
We will consider it if they ask for it.
I don't think we got
Well,
that part.
the way I'm interpreting what I've heard, and I haven't heard from Shannon yet, where you're okay? All right, the way I'm interpreting the way everybody is vote, yes, Mark?
The way that I had, and maybe I should have suggested a preliminary question to this question. When I wrote the letter, I was thinking that the first thing you would decide is whether you wanted to have any overlay districts in the initial draft ordinance. And then after that, what process did you want to use to create or consider the creation of overlays afterwards? So maybe the first question is, do you want to create any overlay districts in the initial draft of this ordinance? Or do you instead just want to pass an ordinance that allows for the use of overlays and consider overlays later pursuant to some defined term?
Okay.
That's
With-
my, yes.
With that explanation, does anybody want to change how they vote?
I would like to preface it on the latter part of what he said. I would, move that we approve, but not approve the specific overlays themselves.
Now you confused me.
So,
I understand that.
yeah, so in terms of, we are approving the process for the overlays, but we're not approving the districts, the defined districts for the overlay districts themselves. So we're not committing the north end to being an overlay district, we're not committing Cape Henry to
Okay,
being an overlay
if that's
district.
what we're doing, then we need to discuss the process.
Right.
Yes, well, I'm with, that's what I'm.
And I guess we need Mark to tell us what the process would be, so.
What does that mean, before you tell us what that means, does that mean that if we do it, whatever this way is, that down the road, every month, we're gonna have to approve something else when somebody else brings it ahead of us? Or I'd rather just approve it now so we don't have to vote on it every 2 months.
Whatever the process we create, if another neighborhood goes through that process and says we would like to be an overlay district, then yes, we would have to approve that overlay district individually.
So if we do it the way you're saying, and then in 2 months, North End comes and says we wanna be an overlay district, then we have to go through this process again to approve them?
No, we would go through an approval process too. We already have the process in place for what an overlay district is. It would just be like a rezoning. So the North End would essentially go for a rezoning to, and that's not the right word, but go through the process to become an overlay district, and we would vote on them becoming an overlay
That's
district.
your definition, but let's see what the attorney says.
You would, if, there's a couple of practical considerations here. Remember that as we sit here today, we know that we have short-term rentals throughout our city in various densities, depending on where you're geographically located. And one of the reasons that we talked about last week that we need to have an ordinance is because right now, our zoning staff is essentially not doing anything in terms of enforcement because council is considering this issue. So you can always say we want to create overlays in the future, but if you pass an ordinance that says unless you're in an overlay, you have to have a CUP, then suddenly there are going to be areas within your city where you have a large number of these where somebody's either got to come into you and say, I want a CUP, or they've got to get their neighborhood to come into you and say, we want an overlay. And in the meantime, the zoning and planning folks still have to figure out, do we start taking enforcement action in that area? So that's why I had suggested to you that maybe one of the first questions was, are there some neighborhoods that you've already heard from the neighborhoods? The district council member or other council members have heard from the neighborhoods and said, this is what, we would like to be in an overlay from the outset so the people in our communities who are doing this don't have uncertainty. If you want to say there will be no overlays initially other than Sandbridge, which you have no control over, then you have to determine what process you want. This is a zoning question, and the General Assembly and the Virginia Constitution say that you have undelegable power and authority over the zoning decision. You can't pass that off to somebody else. It is your zoning decision. So, typically when somebody wants a rezoning or when an area wants an overlay, they come to you, you refer it to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission hears from everyone who's involved and who has a position on it, and they come back to you with a recommendation, and then you also hear from all of the people that are affected by that potential zoning change, and then you make a decision. So for purposes of my letter in page 3, what I said was, here are your considerations. You can use the traditional zoning process, which is what I just described. You can consider an SSD process, which we've talked about before, which basically creates a new legal threshold before this body takes up its constitutionally required zoning authority. And I'm concerned that, there are concerns associated with doing that, but if that's the way you choose to go, we'll work through them. And then, there may be some other things you can do. Maybe you say, we're not gonna put this in our zoning ordinance, but we're gonna have a council policy that says that staff is not gonna bring these things forward unless a council member directs it, and a council member is not gonna bring it forward unless X has happened. And that would not have the effect of law, but would be basically an agreement between this body and its staff about how these would come forward. There's a million different ways, well, there are multiple ways you can do it. I think there probably are a million at this point, I think one question is, do you want to have the traditional zoning consideration, or do you want to go to something else like an SSD type requirement. I will tell you, you've never done that SSD type thing with any other zoning issue that you've ever had. And I don't know of anybody else. I can't tell you nobody else does do it, but I can tell you I don't know anybody else that does do it. So you need, again, to give us direction. Do you want to just stick with the traditional zoning principles? Do you want us to draft something with a minority or a majority support component? We're going to need to spend some time working on how that would play out. You know, what happens when people don't respond? Is that a yes? Is it a no? Are they removed from both the denominator and the numerator? You know, what happens when one of the properties is a condo, and the condo, you know, we've had to file condemnation cases before where the leadership of a condominium who was the subject of the take said, this is great, we're all in agreement for the take, what you're taking and for how much you're going to pay, but because our bylaws require that we have 75% approval, I can't get 75% of my units to agree to anything. I just can't do that. You've got to condemn. You may have the same issue here when you create that threshold. But that's, again, I'm telling you what the concerns are, but I'm not telling you can't do it that way.
I've got two other council members who want to ask you something, but let me ask you something first.
Chair.
If we were to have a public hearing on each one of these proposed overlay districts, and the public had the opportunity to come in and speak on the issue, and then the council reacted to the public hearing and did either approved an overlay district or didn't approve an overlay district, would that meet the code?
Well, what the code requires, actually, is that if there is a proposed overlay district, everyone within that district has to be notified in writing of the potential for the creation of that district, and they're given a chance at that point. They're told when the public hearing is in the planning commission, and then so that's already part of the law. If you're asking me, could we create another public hearing before it was ever referred to the planning commission? You could, absolutely.
Well, I guess my follow-up question is if we have to notify everybody before we can create it, how can we do it? Is there a way to do it without having to notify every property owner?
Not if you want to create it as an overlay.
Not if you want to create it.
And that's why I'm asking, if in the initial draft here, you want to create some of these districts, then that's going to tell staff when we do the re-referral ordinance who they have to mail notice to of the proposed creation.
You're talking about half the city is what you're talking about.
True enough.
Rosemary, you were first.
I think it would be a lot less complicated to create the overlay districts when we ordinance. If we know pretty much where they are, but I think it's super important that we have plenty of public hearings, and I would not have everybody at once. I think divide them up and all. One night have the North End, and another night have Ocean Park area and that sort of thing. So it'll be clear to us what is important to each of those areas. Otherwise, I think it would get confusing and hard to remember. Well, what did Ocean Park?
I think that's what we're talking about. Individual meetings for each individual
Right.
overlay.
Can I finish, please?
Yeah.
Thanks. So you don't get things mixed up. But I was wondering, this is just another thought because there's so many meetings. What about the council and the planning commission having the hearings together as one, as the two bodies together to be able to hear everything?
It's legally permissible, I believe, if you choose it.
If you choose what?
If you choose to do that.
Doesn't mean we
choose to
can't
go
hear,
with planning.
it doesn't mean we can't hear it a second time, but you're gonna be having these meetings all over the place, and the planning commission needs to hear the same things. Maybe it might be worthwhile to hear them together.
All right, then I have a question before we go on, and that is, you drew up an ordinance for me to get this process going, and would we have been able to vote on that ordinance?
Well, your ordinance, Mr. Moss's ordinance, any of the other new ordinances, you'll recall, we talked about the first step in approval of those ordinances would have been to refer them back to the planning commission where that notification would have been given.
I see. So you had always contemplated the notification, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, John?
My question is, when I wrote the letter a couple weeks back, I talked about how important it was to understand the boundaries. So I would hope, since people have different views in the public about what's in and what's out, is it a platted subdivision? This is gonna be an important piece of how, when you say what conglomeration of things can have a district, you have to say, if you put something in, it's every single home that was in that subdivision when it was platted at the time. In North Beach, that may not be so appropriate, how it was done historically. But I think when you start drawing the boundaries, and then once we draw a boundary and you give everyone a notice, this is my question, and then council decides to modify the boundaries and make it smaller, not bigger, but smaller, can that be done without going back through another process? Because it's not an expansion, but a shrinkage? I'm just trying to understand is it solidified boundaries, it's all or none? Or what is the degree of modification once you hear from the public? What's the flexibility of the council to make adjustments based on what they hear? That's what I'm trying to understand.
And that one, I'm gonna ask for a little help from my subject matter experts sitting there.
Some of the areas that we have talked about are actually established zoning districts, like the Oceanfront Resort District. We talked about that being an overlay, but that actually is an established zoning district like R15. So that is established, that's already established. The North End overlay is also an established overlay already.
But we couldn't have an overlay within an overlay of this?
Yes, we could.
Okay,
if
that's
we
what I'm
wanted to.
asking.
We wanted to, but I mean, those are done that way. The others, we've been trying to kind of give you a feel for where they would be. We're trying to keep them to established areas. So you can't go in and take this block and that block and this block. It needs to be a consolidated area.
Well, let's say something came in, let's just use an example, oceanfront. You got Bay Lake Pines and you don't have Bay Lake Pines. And Bay Lake Pines says, yeah, I realize we're in that geographical area, but this is single family, we don't want to be that. You come over to Cape Henry and you got the part that's on the south side of Shore Drive and they say, no, we don't want, but you get the people on the other side of Shore Drive. I'm trying to make sure that once we advertise these districts, what is our capacity to make adjustments within the big boundary if we decide to make it something smaller? We have the ability to do that.
Yes, you do have the ability. The issue would be whether you wanted to fool with the boundaries once you establish them. The SSDs we do in order to get to that 60% or whatever we have. But this is really different. This is about zoning. It's not about taxes, and so.
Well, I'm taking the approach here that maybe the option here I've heard is that council's gonna have hearings and to avoid some of the concerns that Mark has, so I don't necessarily agree with all those. But if he's expressed them, that we don't wanna have participation, well, then we are having to have, we're gonna be acting on feedback we get from folks, I think. Because in the end, we reserve that adjudication for ourselves rather than giving a presumptive threshold vote to a majority of a neighborhood. If I get that right, Mark, I think I did. So I'm just I was answering my question in the context that we were deciding just based on general feedback, but without a minimal threshold having to be met by citizen participation before we consider. I think that's where we were.
Yeah.
Okay.
Barbara?
Well, my question or comment was along the lines of what John was just saying. Somehow or other, there has to be a boundary established. And then the people within that boundary have to have knowledge that this is being considered. And it would seem to me that, I mean, we don't want to start this thing with these communities. We ought to have some process where people are allowed to come forward with this proposal. And maybe it's, just some people from that area who want to. And then we go through the process of identifying everybody or notifying everybody and then telling them about the public hearing. But I really think that, you know, before we start it with any neighborhood, there really needs to be something that has, you know, that neighborhood comes forward in some fashion asking that it be considered and by certain boundaries, because I think we're just opening ourselves for an awful lot of grief if we go out and start the process for everybody. They may not even want it.
The reason, for instance, the Ocean Park overlay, proposed Ocean Park overlay district, the reason I brought that up is because I received a letter from the Civic League requesting that they be an overlay district. And so, based on what you're saying, Barbara, I would assume that because we received that letter, that we would consider having a public hearing to determine whether or not they wanted to, the community itself within the certain boundaries would want to have an overlay district. Is that right, Mark? Is that the way it would be done?
Well, right, and just if I can talk about the context again for a second, just think about what would happen if you didn't have an overlay. Someone would come to you and say, or would come to staff and say, I'd like to have a CUP for a short-term rental. Well, I mean, I think that's where you ended up last week. So rather than considering a single CUP, presumably you would have a group of people who are interested in doing this activity in some sort of geographical area who would come to you saying, rather than having us have to individually ask for CUP consideration, the council having to and planning commission have to take each one up. Instead, we'd like to have an overlay, and here would be the boundary of that overlay. And, you know, in the, you know, one of the three alternatives that we initially sent to the planning commission actually was an overlay based, and I think we had actually drawn rough geographic boundaries of what that overlay was. But yes, Mr. Mayor, I think what would happen is someone would come in like a Civic League or not. They would say, we're interested. You could then have your public hearing to see whether the community at large was supportive of the request by the Civic League.
It would be initiated by them.
It would have been initiated by a request that came to you rather than you just
That's the
saying,
key.
yeah,
That's the key.
yeah, yeah.
It's
So
initiated by them.
you'd just be adding one more step to your process.
But then you would have to, as part of that step, notify every property owner in that area since it's a rezoning.
I want to rip my house up.
Because you can't just have one group of people come, because half of the people out there may not even know that it's been requested. You've got to have some individual notification.
Well, I think at that point, it would trigger the process where everybody would be
Where everybody is
notified and a public
notified,
hearing
yes.
would be held for that specific neighborhood or district.
Right.
That would require a change.
It would be whatever you said it would be for that first step. That first step is not required by the state code or your zoning ordinance. That
But
first
I think that's
step
what we're
is,
saying, that's what we want.
That-
We
that-
want it to be initiated by.
well, and you can, if that's how you want to do it, you certainly have the right to do that. But it could well be that you would just say, we've received this request, here are the outreach that we're going to do to make it as well known as possible. Then if you determine to refer it, when you refer it to the planning commission, then we have to provide written notification to every owner within the boundary.
I think that's what
So
we're saying.
whether you, the question is whether you want to do that twice, because that could get a mite bit expensive and difficult. You might just say for that first one, because you're still gonna have the opportunity to appear before the planning commission, the opportunity to appear when you refer it, the opportunity to appear before the planning commission, the opportunity to appear when it comes back from the planning commission. You might say, just for that first one, we're gonna reach out on social media, we're gonna have, you know, 2 notices in the newspaper. This is what we're gonna do, because you gotta control that. It's only when you go to the notification for the planning commission that the law requires a letter to every owner. Am I right about that, Kay?
Yes, sir.
So if somebody what if an individual comes in and, or writes us a letter and says, I would like you to consider an overlay, for my neighborhood?
I think that would initiate the process.
Any individual?
Absolutely.
More than one person.
Absolutely.
Come on, you don't
I don't know
want
how
to
you
start that for a neighborhood with
We
one
might as well go
person.
down the CUP route if that's what we're gonna do.
Yeah.
Well, I think.
Well, the process has to be, what I think the goal of having the community initiate the process is we're gonna go through this process regardless. And so we would rather have the community initiate the process. That triggers whatever the next mechanism is, whether it be a public hearing or so on and so forth. And so I think once that public hearing is held for that district, it's not like we need to, every time somebody needs to come up, you wouldn't be able to have 3 or 7 people come up and initiate the process 3 or 7 times. Once the process comes up, it's up.
Okay, Jim Wood's been waiting patiently there.
Yeah, so I guess going back to the question of the overlays, each one of these is on here because somebody brought it forward, whether it's from a civic league, whether it's from a group of citizens. For example, the North End, I've met with 2 distinct groups, plus an attorney who claims to represent some other folks, and they all have told me they want short-term rentals. Now,
In writing?
the devil's in the, no, well, yeah, I might have it in
One
writing.
did it, one was.
Yeah,
in
one's
writing.
definitely in writing.
One was in writing.
But the devil's in the details of what they want. So that's where we get. So I kind of think we're backsliding a little bit on this. I think that the overlays are here because there's at least some citizen desire for them. So in my opinion, we should first determine whether or not these overlays are areas that we should consider, and then determine how we're gonna do it, because clearly there's gotta be a public input process. We've gotta go through all this stuff, and I don't think there's any desire to not do that, but I think if we, I kinda think we're kinda getting around and not really focusing on what
Okay,
the issue is.
Let me suggest this. For instance, I have a letter from the Civic League of Ocean Park requesting that they have an overlay.
B.
I guess my question then would be to the council, do you want to initiate the process for having an overlay district in Ocean Park?
Yes, if you have a letter from the
I
civic
guess
league.
that's my question to you. And I'm gonna go through each one of these and do that.
Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't, and we've had this discussion about civic leagues before. I mean, there could only be 4 people at a meeting that do it, so
Jim,
while they initiate it, I think that's fine, but I mean, ultimately, it would be outreach throughout the community, independent of the civic league.
According to the city attorney, we're gonna have to have outreach to the entire community.
Of course, yeah, we should, yeah, we should,
And
yeah.
before we, and they're gonna have to come before the planning commission, then they're gonna have to come before the city council and express their viewpoints on it.
I think that's good, because that way there's multiple opportunities.
Yes, Ben.
Well, and my reason for wanting the community to initiate it is I don't want any perceptions that we're trying to force these overlays on any communities. I want it to be initiated from somebody other than us.
Yeah, I understand. Yes, Barbara.
Well, could we, before we say yes to each of these, have some information about what the boundaries are and who asked it? I mean, I would certainly not want to start this process for any neighborhood based on one person.
I think-
Because I've seen too many things happen to neighborhoods.
We,
Well, I mean, yeah, and I think the easy answer to that is, if we say North End overlay, then planning says, okay, there's an existing North End overlay. If we say Ocean Park, there's an existing development, Ocean Park. I mean, I think as long as we come up with those, and, I mean, if there's something that's kind of nebulous, like this 42nd to 49th Street area, I don't know where that came from, but that's pretty defined, 42nd to 49th Street, so.
the staff, I believe Kay has already done that.
Yes, sir.
Has already outlined,
For all of those districts? I'm not aware of that.
Could we see it?
I believe.
We have the ones that we had before that you all have seen. The others are the old beach, which is actually an overlay. So that is an overlay. And then there was the Lakewood, Pinewood, that area. And then the third one is the area of 42nd to 49th, and that's that little piece of 7 blocks between the North End overlay and the Oceanfront Resort District.
It sort of got left out.
Yeah, it was, yeah, it looked like a mistake. So that would be one.
All right, John, did you?
Well, I want to come back to something we haven't talked about much, but influences all this, because we all said we want, well, some did, I did not, CUPs, but we never said what would be the criteria by which would entitle someone to receive a CUP, or otherwise we would be guilty of it, be arbitrary and capricious. And once we set a precedent, what does that mean? Because it could be that CUP becomes the path of least resistance, and the very outcome we didn't want is the very outcome we incentivized. And so I think when you're looking at this, you cannot examine the overlay districts until you really understand the criteria that you're going to hold yourself accountable to, because you will be judicially adjudicated on it for the CUPs, because once you start granting them, everyone who can meet those conditions, despite what the neighbors might think, we're gonna be sitting here saying yes. We're gonna be sitting here, yes, and Mark in some future executive session is gonna tell us we have to say yes. And then we're gonna be, so I'm just making sure that when we go down this route, we need to understand what is the criteria that we are gonna be applying, because then people kind of need to know what's gonna be happening in the overlay district as well, because it's gonna be about the same. Except, so I just think you just can't put that over here like it doesn't exist. That person's at the table, and you just need to understand that they could be counter purposes.
All right, well, maybe what we need to do then, before we make decisions on overlays, is maybe we need to make decisions on what the rules and regulations are going to be for people who are operating short-term rentals. And then, once we've done that, then we can deal with whether, and make those rules and regulations public, then we can deal with the issue of the overlays. Does anybody disagree with that?
Would that include the criteria for conditional use permits, when you say that? Does that include the criteria that we would use to evaluate conditional use permits? Because I think that's a part of that process.
Mark,
I would think that typically your CUP requirements would incorporate what you're requiring of STRs generally, and if those were achievable, then that would be your
Super, I'm just trying to make sure we're agreeing. Okay, I'm all set.
Okay,
Just conscious
so would you like to go to the rules and regulations first?
Sure.
How about it, council? What do you want to do?
Yes.
Sure, Mayor, let's do it.
Okay.
Hands first.
Yeah.
Start with Shannon.
We'll start with Shannon.
Every time.
The girl that agrees with you, you're gonna throw her under the bus first. All right.
All right. The last time we went around the table on these issues, a majority of the council said that they agree with grandfather. And so the question that we have before us is, what would the beginning date for grandfathering be? And would it be first month, first day, 2018, or when would it be? Yes, Barbara?
I had a question when we talked about this last time, and some things have happened since we talked about it that have made me have the question even more. All of these that are operating aren't necessarily operating well. And I don't want to be in a position of grandfathering something that I know is causing a lot of difficulty. So that really makes it difficult if we just say, okay, we're going to grandfather everything. I know, for example, the one that I keep hearing from in Lagamar, it's really upset that neighborhood. And several people, came to my district forum Thursday night, and they had an awful lot of support, and people who said, I wouldn't want that next to me. But if we automatically are going to grandfather everything that's there, then it's there. And what's going to be the process for determining whether something is operating as it should? If something is operating as it should, I wouldn't have any problem with grandfathering it, but if something is creating a problem, I don't want to just automatically grandfather it and then it's there.
John first, then Jim.
Well, property can create a problem after it's been grandfathered when it didn't have a problem, so you got, risk exposure is there. But the real question on that would be, as we get towards regulations, of the 30-something regulations that we already have, why is it that the city is apparently incapable or unable or legally impeded from addressing it? That would be highlighted information. And if I lived in a community that was thinking about having an overlay district, I would certainly want to look at that case study and say, why is it that we, the city, with our current existing rules and regulations and what else we have, are unable to address it? That would be something I'd want to know, because that would tell me that that's going to be a carryover problem no matter where I'm at. I think dates are always hard to draw, but you got to draw them. I could live with the 1st of January. I could live with the 1st of June. I don't think you want to say it's in the future, because that just creates another set of incentives you don't want to have, because that's what we're trying to get more stuff under, so you wouldn't want to do that. But I could live with 1 May, 1 June, 1 January, just something looking backward, just like tax rules do, because there's a reason why they do that. What I would like to understand is where these cases are, and we are unable to provide governance relief from what the community sees as a problem. Why is it our current regulations are insufficient to address that? Maybe we just don't want to regulate, but we got to understand where the gaps are as we move forward, I think.
Jim?
I was going to say something very similar along the lines of what John said. I had somebody that called me last week, I guess, and the gentleman told me, he said, well, my neighbors are complaining about my short-term rental. He said, I don't live in the area, but, you know, I'm the reason why they're complaining. And then he told me, and I said, well, is it registered? And he goes, no, I haven't done all that. And so clearly he's not following the transient occupancy rules and things like that. So it just seems to me that perhaps a look back is better than moving forward, because I think that would just have a big rush of registrations.
When you say looking forward, you mean of some date in the future?
No, I said look back, like John said.
Like January of 18, May of 18, something.
January, anytime between last month and January is fine with me, so.
Yep, me too.
I say yesterday, it's the beginning of our fiscal year.
Beg pardon?
I say yesterday, as of July 1, 2018, because it's the beginning of our fiscal year.
That's a simple, good.
That's brilliant, Council Lady.
Thanks, Councilman.
That's why you were called on first.
So Shannon, you're first.
July 1, 2018. There you go.
July 1, 2018, all right. That's Shannon, all right.
And trademark that.
John?
I agree with that. But,
Okay.
I don't want to end it, we just muddy it the more that we talk about it. But I mean, to Barbara's point, I think it's important that we grandfather it. I mean, I've heard from so many people we've heard no complaints from the community, but have invested their life savings or their children's education money with the thought that they were going to be able to continue this because we've allowed it to happen. So you don't want to, that's why I think grandfathering is important. But, to the handful, and I think that if we actually gridded out the number of complaints that we received from neighbors, that it's really not a great number. How do we not necessarily give them this by right opportunity if they haven't been good players? I don't know the answer on how you do that, but I mean, I think that warrants some additional discussion that, independent of the date, which I agree with Shannon, is, how do you not necessarily automatically give these folks the right to continue a bad operation?
Okay, Rosemary?
I agree with Shannon, but I would hope once we get that 311 number in place for the short-term rentals, that's going to help regulate some of the bad players. Problem is, we don't have all those things in place now, but once we do all this, there will be means for people to report when there's issues.
Jim?
I agree on
For
that.
now, a year. Nobody's been able to use it.
Okay, I agree to July 1. Barbara?
Well, if we're going to grandfather, that's a good date, but I'm still not comfortable with the process. I mean, we've had 311, we reactivated it a year ago in that budget. It's not been used, it's not even been attempted to be used, we don't have any process. There's no track record of complaints, so how are we going to not do it? I mean, I really feel sorry for these people. Every week I get a new batch of pictures about what they've had to put up with over the weekend, and they have no recourse.
All right, Bob?
Yeah, I would go for, I would subscribe to it, but, if I could just say one thing going forward, I think it's critical that we remember that the short-term rental business industry in Virginia Beach is very big, and we got to try to make it as user-friendly as possible, unencumbered as possible. I agree with the grandfathering, but I guess a concern that I have, for a gentleman that I met that had a number of rentals, what messages are going to be sent to the industry if we have to go through a tremendous amount of regulations to establish? I see the main problem being, was that, these big party houses and everything that really started a lot of consternation. But the point is, though, a lot of people depend on income, especially retirees that rent out their houses, and they depend on this income. And my hope is that we don't create such a cumbersome, I hope we can kind of lean it down and make it user-friendly and user-simple. And then I think the next phase, once we do that, is an education thing. I got a group, Homestead, wants me to come out and talk to them. That's an area that's not predisposed to short-term rentals, but there's a lot of ambiguity about, what's involved, if there is, and everything. And, I'm just saying, we're dealing with a delicate subject, and I'm just delighted that we're sitting around talking at length the way we are, and deliberating this through. I think that's a very good thing.
All right, John?
Yes, and I have a lot of respect for industry. I have a lot of respect for residents, too.
Ben?
I agree with July 1st, and, Bobby, what I would say is that I think the message we want to send to the short-term rental industry is that we don't want them to create a business model going into our residential neighborhoods and disrupting the quiet enjoyment of life that you have in our neighborhoods right now. That's the message we want to send.
Yeah, but I think we can, work out a win-win situation if we put our heads together in the right way.
Okay, the next three questions that I have here all refer to different dates, so we've settled that issue, okay? The next question is, should a material alteration to the structure affect the grandfathered status? And I'm assuming that means if somebody enlarges their structure.
Well, if somebody redevelops their two-bedroom bungalow into an 8-bedroom house, does that affect the grandfathering?
Absolutely.
I think it should. I think anything that changes the footprint
Like an expansion of a non-conforming use.
should invalidate the grandfathering.
All right, let's
That's
go
my
around the
view.
table. John?
Before we close on that discussion, I mean, we want to encourage, independent of short-term rentals or not, we want to give people the ability to improve their homes, right? So typically, if somebody's going to improve their home, they're typically going to add square footage. It may not be another bedroom, but they're not going to just say, well, I'm just going to make it nicer, but I'm going to keep it the same. And so I don't want to get into a situation where, and I understand Barbara's concern, where you knock down a little bitty house and then you put in an event home, which is, as Bobby said, kind of where we got into it. But I don't want to have a situation where we've said, okay, in order for you to be grandfathered, you can't improve your property. And I think that if we're too tight on that, that's what we're going to end up doing. And so I just think we need to think through it before we're hard and fast on, okay, an improvement means that you're no longer grandfathered.
Good point. Rosemary?
Maybe you could just say, to include extra bedrooms.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
If you're gonna put a sunroom on your house, it shouldn't affect it, but if you're gonna add on additional bedrooms, then that might.
Increasing the capacity.
Can that be determined on a case-by-case basis at that point?
it can be, but it's a judgment call at that
Don't
point.
want to do that. I think that gets hard.
When they go to planning with their, I mean, they're gonna have to have permits and plans and all of that.
But once you say judgment, you do inject the possibility over time, because people don't prove to be inter-rater reliable. You then end up setting yourself up for people looking for a pattern of inconsistency, and then things get overturned and you just lose it. If you don't have a very hard and fast rules, you open the judgment, then people think, hey, there's some kind of favoritism. You inject all sorts of other things you would prefer a governmental process not to have, my personal opinion.
But Mark, we have a lot of leeway, don't we, in making those determinations?
Well, in defense of them, yes, you do.
Yeah, I mean,
As
I
long as you
understand
can
what you're
prove
saying
that
as
there's a
far as-
rational basis for the decision. You know, the other thing you could do is just say a percentage increase over the existing livable space,
Something's easy.
so that you can give people the ability to, I mean,
Have them pick.
that would be, perhaps more objectively provable or disprovable, rather than what's the nature of the addition.
So a percentage increase in the square footage of the facility, is that what you're saying, or the property?
That's one thing you could consider.
structure.
I'm just throwing it out there.
I think that makes sense to me.
Well, and then you're letting the market decide what, I mean, like, you know, I added on to my last home, and you sit there and you go, well, does it make sense financially for me to invest in a new kitchen or a bigger kitchen, or is it better for me to add another bedroom? And so, you know, you're gonna have those are just regular homeowner decisions, and you don't want that to be impeded by the fact that they're gonna lose a right that they have today because they made the improvements that they would have otherwise made independent of that regulation.
What would the percentage be that you would think would be reasonable?
10% on a 1,000 square foot house is a lot different than 10% on a 50,000 square foot house, you know. It's a little hard.
I'm gonna throw 30% out just as a number.
30%?
It's big.
I could go with a quarter, but that 30 sounds high to me. I realize it's shades of gray, I understand that.
27.5.
Yeah, 27.
No, but I
28.
But I think more importantly than just the square footage is that people shouldn't have to be able to use a variance to do, if you're saying, I'm doing this expansion, but now I'm needing a variance to a setback, I'm needing a variance to
That's a good
this,
point.
it ought to be, I need a variance to the maximum square footage of my lot that can be built on, because we have rules that deal with that as well. You know, I think we have to ask what, because you're not saying you can't do it, you're just saying that to do that, you now have to come back and get a conditional use permit in the future if you want to establish what a prior use was. It isn't that they don't have the right to the use, because it just means there's a process they got to go through it. What you're really saying is you can go do all this stuff and you never have to come back to that process. At some point, what you've done is to get the advantage that you had to give, which in society, that's not unusual. You want this flexibility, you forgoed something you can't stay whole of everything. I mean, life isn't just like that. Not like I live anyway.
Barbara?
The other fly in the ointment is when there are other structures on the property that are being used for rental. For example, this one that I keep referring to started out as they were renting the pool house, and then they got to now they're renting the house. So, you know, do we really know how many around town are renting out something other than the primary structure? And because we've heard of all kinds of things, but this particular example was started out as renting the pool house, and so now they're renting the pool house and the house.
Rosemary?
Well, and how does that affect the overlay districts?
Well, if you're in an overlay district, it's gonna be by right, so.
It doesn't affect the overlay districts.
Like in Fairfield or Pembroke,
So
Arizona, or my neighborhood.
outside of the overlay district, what we're talking about is properties that currently exist as of July the 1st that have been doing short-term
Have
rentals
registered and
have
paid
been
a
registered
transient
and
occupancy tax.
paid the occupancy tax and all that. And if they want to improve their property, to expand it in some way, the limitation on that expansion whereby they could still be a short-term rental
Without a CUP.
without a CUP would be a percentage of the size of the current structure.
Well, that's just one thing that we've.
So that's what I'm trying to
Yeah,
get at, is
5% not to exceed
is that
1,000
what
square feet.
percentage of that
That's
structure
huge.
would be appropriate, and, sorry.
John's got a good
I
answer.
was looking at the zoning administrator.
You say 25% or not to exceed 1,000 square feet? That allows for some of our much bigger homes that have bigger lots, and that wouldn't be necessarily a big addition if you lived back in my neighborhood.
Let's get a
I've got a couple.
suggestion here.
Do you want to do 30% each time, or do you want to do 30% cumulative?
Oh, it's a cumulative. I always assumed it's not.
Cumulative, yeah.
Okay, cumulative?
I say 20%.
I can
But
go with
we
that
haven't
too.
decided on whether it's 20% or 30%
But
yet.
you know, if
I
they,
like what John said, though.
What's that?
John said 25% not to exceed 1,000 square feet. And that way that gets you,
Whichever is less.
yeah, that kind of gets you, because 1,000 square foot's a good size addition.
It is.
Well, if you're in a
Yes.
R1 neighborhood, it wouldn't be so huge.
do we need to look at this, and I say that going backwards, because if we've got, they can only rent so many times a week, and they have to have parking spaces for the people, and we control the activity that's happening there, do we care that there's 10 people versus 6 people in the house? If they've still only got one car, or 2 cars, or they still only stay 2 times a week, I mean, does it matter how many are actually in that house?
Yes, because I think
Might matter to the neighbors.
I think we're gonna find out, you're gonna be able, from a land use perspective, and we haven't talked about views of all those regulations, how enforceable they are, and how realistic and meaningful they are. So when you look at what you can control, something you can see from space is the footprint of the home. I think some of these other things we've talked about are logistically not enforceable and false expectations, but what can physically be on the property is going to be constrained by something you can't control, which is size and what's on the lot. I think some of these other things are gonna be very, very difficult, and I don't envy the staff if we adopt some of those things, trying to make them work. I think they're gonna do doing this, pulling their hair out.
All right, so your suggestion, John, was 25%.
Not to exceed 1,000 square feet, whichever is less. Because that allows for, if your place doesn't give you 1,000 square feet, but if you live back somewhere, you got a 6,000 square foot house, and there are some of those beach, and they want to add a big wing on the back for whatever reason, more power to them. But they were grandfathered by chance. I doubt many of those big houses have short-term rentals, but there's always you never know who's out there. But I think that 25% is a pretty big allotment, and they're going to still have to meet all the other restrictions that go with the footprint. You can't have so much of your lot covered. We have all those other zoning regulations that are going to apply.
And
How
the
does that-
the base square footage would then be measured from the July 1, 2018.
Right,
Right.
yeah.
Tax records that Jerry.
Barbara?
And could that also be whatever structure is being rented on the property? You know, if they're renting an accessory structure or whatever, they're only grandfathering what they are renting at July 1.
What they have registered.
Do they register if it's an accessory structure?
Just wanted to bring it to your attention, all the regulations that have been proposed still do not permit an accessory structure being rented. There's only a few districts in the city where 2 dwelling units can be on one lot. So whatever you pass, everything that's been considered so far would not permit an accessory dwelling to be
Probably
rented.
the cleanest way to do it, so no accessory structure should be used as an excuse.
Correct, unless in the ordinance that you proposed, you made those provisions.
Would everybody be able to agree to 25% not to exceed 1,000 feet? Ben?
Yes.
All right, John?
Thumbs up.
All right, Bob? Okay. Barbara?
Yes, with that accessory structure staying as a, no.
I'm okay. Jim?
Yep.
All right,
Yes.
Rosemary? John?
Yes, sir.
Shannon?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. We got that done. Now, I think The conditional use permits,
Why don't we have any?
CUP expiration and renewal. Should the initial conditional use permit for the short-term rental be for 1 year? Should it be for 5 years?
3 years.
Or is there, what term limit would you want on it?
That's a long time.
You say? Barbara's, Rosemary's saying
What was
3
the,
years.
what was the question again?
The question is, should the, what's the term of the conditional use permit?
Because you all decided last week you wanted to have an expiration date.
Right.
Up to renewal.
5 years.
Have them all.
All right, right now, we got one person for
Like an
5.
auction?
Well, I think it's different. It was administratively renewed, and it doesn't have to, they don't have to jump through a lot of hoops. I think 2 years is fine, because that gives you your opportunity. If there's a problem, you've got an opportunity for relief that's a lot sooner.
You mean if they go down every year? and-
You just got to do it administratively. It's not,
Years
the only reason it would be denied is if you weren't doing the other stuff. And I think that gives us some teeth to whatever regulations that we might put into there.
So they have to go down every 2 years to Phil's office?
Well, I
or-
mean, to do it administratively, I don't know, they have to physically appear. It's,
Planning, they would go to planning, right? It's
I mean, it's
Where would they
Called
go?
Barry.
What's the process that's used for other
Yeah.
CUPs that are administratively approved, reviewed? If I can, I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
When a time limit's put on a CUP, when that time limit's up, the applicant comes back to the planning staff. We look at the application, we see if there's been any complaints. We look at how it's functioned, because when it goes through council, you know, they express how they want to function and, you know, how it's going to work. We make sure it works that way. And if it's working the way they said, there's no complaints, we administratively.
But when there are complaints, are you the people adjudicating the merits of the complaint, or the fact that there is a record of complaint automatically means that the council has to see it? I'm always trying to understand what we're delegating and what we're not, and who's making the discretionary judgments about what's a legitimate complaint and who's not. And if there are complaints and you're making an adjudication that they're not material and you're not recommending it, are we gonna get a 90-day notice so that the district council member can say, hey, I have a different view of that than you do, and I want it brought back? I'm just making sure that the council itself, over something that can be very controversial, is not losing its prerogative to act and delegated that away to someone else's administrative adjudication of the merits of a complaint. I mean, I think there are complaints that aren't meritorious, let me just give you that up front. But I'm just trying to understand, we're the ones in the end that are held accountable for the places, not the people who gave them the administrative extension. And I'm just trying to make sure how we as a body are making sure our prerogative to inject is not being lost.
Well, under the current system, if I have a conditional use permit on a piece of property, if somebody complains, comes down to the city and complains, what do you do?
We take the complaint, we send an inspector out, and we investigate the complaint. Whatever, depending on the complaint, is the process in which we investigate. You know, if there's several
There's
complaints.
an egregious violation.
An egregious violation. The zoning ordinance does allow for city council to revoke that conditional use permit, although normally it does not get to that point. If it's an egregious violation, a notice of violation, we go through that process, which goes to a notice of violation, and then court proceedings if necessary.
And you make that call of whether or not you bring it to council, is that correct?
As far as the revocation, yes.
Right.
Yes, but at least in my time, there has not been one that has come forward where we haven't worked it out prior to that.
Yes, John?
Well, my concern is a lot of things that we've done have well-established histories, and there's a body of precedent that we act on. This is a case where we're moving into new territory where the norms of what we're looking to enforce and adopt and accept are not known. And so everybody, each in our head, probably has our own thought of what that norm is, as do inspectors. But collectively, we as a city don't have that normative standard. And that's what my concern is about, when we don't have that normative standard relative to new situation that technology has given us the opportunity to do, and people to earn money, that I just trying to make sure that we're not losing our hands-on knowledge of what that's out there, and we just create this distance, and, you know, ignorance is bliss until it blows up, and then it's a hot seat. And I'm just trying to make sure that that doesn't get lost until we really, it's like when we have a brand-new class of ship, we always put a more senior officer on that ship, because it's the first of the class, a lot of things happen, you're still trying to work out the bugs and understand what you want to communicate, and I think that's what we want here, and I'm just trying to figure it, not today, but I need to have some feel for how we're not gonna lose, this doesn't drop off the radar site because we passed this ordinance, we passed it to an administrator, and we don't have active knowledge as we go through our growing pains on this particular new approach to letting people turn their homes into income generators, which isn't a bad thing, but it's new.
Let me say this, the way I see this, if we set a time frame, a term for which a permit is granted, and if there's a complaint about a particular house, the staff would have the responsibility to bring that complaint to us. If there is no complaint and the people come down to renew their permit, then they should be renewed.
I'm with you. I'm just asking that when they adjudicate those complaints, they found it not meritorious before they renew, at least we get some advance notification of what the complaints were and the basis of adjudication, so it's a conscious on our part that we didn't want to inject ourselves.
Yes, John?
In terms of the practical nuts and bolts administration of this, to Barbara's example earlier, what'll really happen in the real world is somebody's gonna have someplace in Lagabar that's problematic. They're gonna call Barbara. Barbara is then gonna call the planning department and say, when is this CUP up for renewal? I'm getting a lot of complaints. And then she's gonna tell Kevin that we need to have a conversation about this before it gets renewed. And so, I mean, that's really what's gonna happen.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, there's probably very few problematic short-term rentals out there that someone around this table has not been contacted about. And I suspect that every one of us would contact the planning department if we knew that there was some discretionary act that was getting ready to occur in terms of someone renewing a CUP.
So the process.
So 2 years, getting back to the original question, I think.
2
is
years,
appropriate.
okay. Does everybody agree with 2 years? Shannon?
Yes, sir.
Okay. John?
Yes.
Rosemary? Jim? I'm okay. Barbara?
Yeah.
Okay.
I
Bob?
agree, but I'm not a real big fan of the COP for this, but, you know, if we gotta have it 2 years.
Well, all right.
I don't support conditional use permits, so voting on the 2 years is for something I'm not gonna vote for, makes no sense.
All right.
So, no,
2 years, good.
2 years, okay. It's 2 years then.
conditional use
Okay.
permits is
Could
a
I bring up a
nightmare.
point of clarification, Mr. Mayor?
Yes.
Did we, at any length, define what would happen, is the grandfathering transferable upon sale?
It goes with the land, so yes.
It goes with the land deed? Okay, just want to make sure. Because there are a lot of people that own multiple properties, and if they want to get out, and if they had to switch in any way, that would be problematic. Okay. Thank you.
All right, the next question.
May I ask
Yes,
a question
Barbara.
about that? Okay, property sold. Person who buys it doesn't immediately start doing it. How long would it still be there for somebody to start doing short-term rentals? I mean, does it have to be, if there's a lapse of time, does the grandfathering go away, or how is that going to be monitored?
Well, to take it back one step, and I'm looking again at Kevin and Kay, a CUP runs with the land. The grandfathering is a right that you are creating in the owner, and you can say it runs with the land or it doesn't, I believe. And you also, you know, with respect to a CUP, I believe, is there a lapse period? It's 2 years, right?
With nonconformities, yes, it's 2 years. If there's a nonconformity and it ceases to exist in that capacity, after 2 years, it loses its nonconformity. So in this case, it would probably, the easiest way would be the registration date and process, where the new owner would have that grandfathering but would still need to register.
Same timeline.
But
Okay. And if he's not paying anything, that means he's not renting it, so he's not using it.
Our whole purpose of grandfathering, I thought, which made sense, was people because of our failure to enforce or to overlook, laissez-faire, you want to call it, so they've invested and they've made investments, and so when you take someone's, change their stuff, just that owner, well, then you're still materially changing the value of the underlying property, which is the very thing we were trying to preserve by the grandfathering, was not just the income transactions of the current owner, but the underlying value upon which that transactional revenue determines. So I think you gotta let it go. Unless I misunderstood what you're doing with grandfather, I think we can't make a distinction saying it's just the owner. It really transfers the property, or I think we're having to live with the consequences of our own failure to enforce, and that's one of them.
I wasn't attempting to tell you what your policy decision was. I was just telling you have a policy decision to make.
No, I was just getting back to Barbara's point about just an owner, and I'm just trying to explain my view is I think it's with the property, because that's the thing we ultimately we're trying to protect, is not the transactional revenue.
Going to deal with one more question, and then we're going to drop this subject for today, because we got some other fairly important things to deal with. The last question that I'm going to ask you today is, when the use permit expires, should the planning staff review and renew, or should the city council review and renew?
Planning staff.
Say again?
Staff.
I just want to,
Or should it come back to the council?
When the use permit expires, in other words, should the planning staff review and renew the use permit, or should the city council have to renew the use permit?
I think we just had that discussion, did we not?
Correct.
Okay.
Administrative review.
Yes, but.
Administrative review with notice if there have been issues.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Correct. That's what I just want to make sure that's what I
Okay,
heard.
so the staff would be the ones that would do it. Everybody agree with that?
Yes.
Great. Okay, that's it for the day on short-term rentals, folks, because we've got some other very important things to deal with. So we'll come back to it the next chance we get the opportunity. And, thank you for that discussion. That was helpful. We got somewhere.
We did.
Working.
So,
Questions answered.
all right. The next item on the agenda is the city manager's briefing on Asheville Park cost participation.
Yes, sir. Mayor, members of council, we return today to take up and continue the discussion with regards to our cost proposal options, and you saw Chandra, who is executive assistant to Tom, passing around a new set of briefing charts because we've got a change to one of the proposals that Tom's going to walk us through. He's going to back up a few steps and reset the stage and be able to have a discussion with you all about your preferences.
All right, so the charts in front of you should say decision briefing, not information briefing. And there was a typo on, I think it was page 6, but it's a minor typo, but we did get it fixed. So we're here again to talk about the cost participation agreement for Asheville Park. This CPA, or cost participation agreement, it has to be consistent with a proffer modification request that's been made by the developer of Asheville. The proffer modification request that's on your current agenda right now was made by the developer in 2015. It was approved by the Planning Commission and the staff back then. Council deferred it for quite some time, brought it back on June 19th, and then deferred it again to today. There are two primary requests in there in that proffer modification request. One is to transfer some of the maximum potential lots amongst the various villages. There are 5 villages, and it's a request to move some of these lot limits among the villages. Village C, which currently has a lot limit of 98, would go to 116. The request would recover some lots from Village B, which has already been built and constructed, but 5 of those lots were not built in Village B. Village D would increase by 3. Village E would drop by 16. A second part of this proffer request is to alter the restrictions on the lot sizes. And the developer feels they need that because the current, what was approved back in quite some time ago was, may have worked back then in the economies that were driving the housing market in the early 00s and 2004, 2005. But today, those restrictions force a very inefficient development, and it pushes their costs into areas that make it tough, or if not impossible, to market the lots. So, Council, we've discussed this many times. Council, the last time we discussed it, asked us to come back to go discuss with the developer some other cost participation proposals, and I will walk you through those. The first chart up here has 2 columns. The first one is what I'll call the status quo, no cost participation. It's up there to show you what the current situation is. If council took 0 action, made no action, and just said keep everything the way it is. It's not something that staff recommends. We would have to move forward independently with the Phase 1 improvements in Asheville Park. There's a lot of uncertainty and inefficiency in having us try to move forward independently. Hopefully with the developers' cooperation, but not necessarily. There's a lot of conflicts that can happen, and the right-of-way acquisition really works against us in a situation like that. A lot of state requirements as to what we would have to value the right-of-way acquisition. But under that, the Village C has 98 maximum lots in it. The project, we estimate, will cost us $13.4 million. It's a very uncertain number. Could go up or down because the cost of excavation is highly volatile and dependent upon where we might be able to dispose of it or use it elsewhere. As I indicated, the costs for right-of-way acquisition would be highly uncertain. But under this proposal, which is the status quo, Asheville Park could develop to a maximum of about 494 lots. The construction, we feel like under the best of circumstances, we could get the design work and permitting done in a year, but again, that's uncertain, and that would take us at least 2 years to complete the project. Now, the cost participation proposal that the developer has agreed to tentatively, consistent with the proffer modification request in front of you, would increase Village C's maximum lot potential to 116. They indicate they would need these lot modifications, the restrictions, modifications to the lot restrictions. The developer would pick up $3.1 million of an $11.1 million project. The city would pay the other $8 million. The city would also buy the area for one of the storage ponds in fee simple at a cost of about $400,000. And the reason for that is if we own that storage pond in fee simple, the city can net $2.1 million in stormwater credits. Under this participation proposal, which we call number 1, lots in Village C would increase from 98 to 16. Village D would increase by 3, Village E would decrease by 16, and the total would, maximum lots in Asheville would be 499. Should the developer, under this proposal, get much favorable bids and the costs come in much lower than we anticipate, we would share the costs, the cost savings with the developer 50-50, but only after they kept the first $1 million in savings. The developer would be able to begin this work next spring and finish it in the summer following next spring by essentially June of 2020. You ask us to go back and discussed with the developer some alternate proposals, and we did, and so we brought back two proposals, Proposal 2 and 3. Much of the construction, in fact, virtually all of the construction of Phase 1 is the same. Much of the boilerplate of the cost participation agreement would be the same, but I have summarized what the differences would be. In cost CPA Proposal 2, Village C would remain at 98 lots as it is limited today, but the developer would still need these modifications to the lot restrictions. The developer would not participate directly in the cost share of the Phase 1, so the city would pick up the entire $11.1 million project. But the developer would dedicate all right-of-way to the city, including the BMP 10A and fee simple, so the city would still be able to net the $2.1 million stormwater credits. Under this scenario, the number of lots that would be could develop under a maximum condition in Asheville would actually drop down from 494 to 481, and that would be the result of the drop in the 18 lots from Village C. If there were cost savings, the city would realize 90% of those cost savings. If their bids came back much lower than we anticipate, the city would recover 90% of that, and the construction time would be identical.
Could I ask, I think you said 18 from Village E, but it's 16, right?
Well, depending on how you look at it, the difference between 481 and 499 is 18, and the difference between 481 and 494 is 13. It depends on whether you're comparing it to Proposal 1, which actually picks up 5 additional lots from what's possible today. 481 from 499 is a drop of 18 lots. And 98 from 116 is 18 lots.
I'm just confused because Village E started at 56 lots. And
Yes, it did.
40, so it's taken 16.
But the developer indicated they would still take the drop in Village E from 56 to 40, which is a drop of 16. But you'll please notice you have an increase from Village D from 41 as it stands today to 44. So it picks up 3. Pretty sure we did the math there, right?
It don't really make sense. I can't follow them.
You hadn't got to it yet.
Okay.
So CPA Proposal 3, very similar to CPA Proposal 2 in the financial aspects. But the difference would be that the developer would ask for 116 maximum lots in Village C, but would forego all lots in Village D. So they would, Village C would increase from 98 to 116. The lot restrictions in terms of the sizes would still need to be modified. The developer would not cost share in the direct cost of Phase 1. The city would pick up the entire $11.1 million. The developer would donate and dedicate all right-of-way to the city, including BMP 10A and fee simple, so we could still net out the $2.1 million in water quality credits. And because of the reduction of, well, depending on how you do the math, either 39 or 44 lots, the total number of buildable lots, maximum buildable lots in Asheville would decrease to 455. It's about an 8% reduction. The city would still net 90% of any cost savings due to favorable bids, and the construction would still be the same time period, which would begin next spring and wrap up by the summer thereafter. So there is one issue that has come up, and it's one, I guess, of a bit of a cash flow issue. Under cost participation agreement option 1, there's enough money in the FY19 CIP, which I think is 7-047, to cover the cost participation agreement. If you looking at that column there, the on-site work by the developer is about $7.2 million. We add in the purchase of BMP 10A, take out the developer's cost share. That nets total funding that on the cost participation agreement of $4.5 million. We need about $800,000 to complete the design and permitting work of the portions that we're going to build. That brings it up to $5.3 million. And the funds available in the CIP as of July 1 is $7.2 million. So everything, there's plenty of money. You could all execute a cost participation agreement at any time.
Shannon.
But under cost participation 2 and 3, because the developer will not be making that $3 million cost participation, we actually come up short by $800,000. Now, it's not, we come up short because on July 1 of 2019, in FY19, we aren't able to fund both our design work and the cost participation work. That would be fundable by July 1, 2019, because another $4 million is in the CIP. So it's really just a matter of timing, not as much any cash flow issues. So how we would propose to handle that would be to transfer $1 million from the Eastern Shore Drive Drainage Phase 1 in this fiscal year to Asheville, and then in fiscal 2020 transfer that $1 million back. Basically a switch in the CIP. $1 million from Shore Drive Phase 1 to Asheville, and in the next fiscal year, $1 million back. That will not affect the Shore Drive project because Public Works has assured me that there is enough money already appropriated to date in that CIP. It will not interfere with their construction. So if council was agreeable to that and selected proposal 2 or 3, we would bring an agenda item on August 7th consistent with that decision.
All right. Are you ready for my idea?
Yes, sir.
Tom? I've been looking at all 3 of these proposals, and frankly, my concern is not just the current drainage issues of Asheville Park, but the future drainage issues that we're going to have to deal with as the development continues. And as you recall in proposal number 3, the Home Federal, HOFD, proposed the reduction or the elimination of D, which would add the transfer, I think it was 18 units out of that to Asheville Park C, I think it was. And that was a reduction of 44 total units, net reduction of 44 total units. My concern is that in all of these proposals, we're not looking to the future. And that if we were to go with 3, which I think what might be where we ought to go, but if we were to go to 3, I would like for the developer to dedicate that land that is in D to the city so that we would have that for future BMT and drainage purposes, and it would add to the effectiveness of our drainage proposals for Asheville Park in general and for the future development that might occur. So and I've passed out to you a modified ordinance that would reflect that, And basically, it would give us a lot of flexibility in the future to deal with the future drainage issues of Asheville Park. And so the real change that I am suggesting to you is on the first page there, which is item, we're at the bottom, item 4, that begins at line 42. It says, the acceptance of a dedication of the land comprising Village D is hereby authorized, provided the developer dedicates the land in fee simple and at no cost to the city. With having said that, I would like for Tom, if he doesn't mind, to kind of give an overview of what the effects of this might be.
Has the developer agreed to that?
Yes.
And can you, okay, that wasn't my question.
So, yes, Tom.
So in the memo I sent you, we indicated that the proposal C, which would open up Village D to additional storage ponds, was really a game changer of a bit. It provides options that we really haven't had in Asheville, which was finding places to put additional storage. Asheville Park is seriously short of storage. And so our fix has been to add more lakes and to modify it so we could have those lakes drop down lower to have more storage. In addition to that, there'd be some immediate benefits because this, if D was not going to develop, this culvert is not necessary, and this canal here, which was stretched along this road in order to keep lots open for Village D, doesn't have to do that. Instead, you can have a canal run directly from 10 to 10A. So that is going to produce, it's a, what I'll call an incremental savings to the project early on. If we did get around in the future to turning that open land into a storage pond, there's some synergy to be obtained there. Of course, we get more storage, but also the material, we would time this so the material could be used on future road projects that require fill. The two that come to mind immediately are the Sandbridge Nimmo 7A and 7B. The other thing is we would still, as owners of those lakes, we would again net the additional stormwater credits. So even though we would not recognize the cost share from the developer, we would see benefits in the future as we were able to use that fill, use the sand that's in that area for other road projects and get the net water quality benefits. But the big thing was more storage. We had looked at some scenarios in the past as to whether or not more larger ponds could be put on some of the additional villages. And phase 1 will increase the current storage in Asheville from 91 acre-feet to 183 acre-feet, practically doubling it. If we were to build an additional storage pond on Village D, we could push that up to 250 acre-feet. At that point, you're now getting enough storage that you could handle the 100-year, maybe even larger storm, because there's actually simply enough storage in the system for storms that size. So we believe in the future this has a lot of good long-term benefits. The one thing we give up is the $3 million today.
Yes, Barbara.
If I could, and this is a nice surprise to hear that and these possibilities, because one of my major concerns, and I've said it over and over, is that area to the south that floods all the time, even in a thunderstorm, which is, I guess, what we have labeled as Basin 23 in this study. And part of Village D drains into, is Basin 23.
I believe you are correct.
And it drains to the south. And so if we were to have this property, I would really hope that it would give us opportunities also to really address what's happening to the south. And I would hope that maybe this Basin 23, which hasn't started its modeling yet, could be one that is started pretty soon. And I hope it will be boots on the ground as well as some kind of computer modeling, because something is not right out there. And I think it comes from this Village D properties. So this would give us an opportunity, particularly if the city owns this Village D properties. But there's also another piece that's not in Village D, but it's connected to that goes south, that doesn't even show up on most of these. I just have it on these maps that I got yesterday. But I think this would give us a real opportunity to try to do something with those areas along New Bridge Road and Indian River Road, which flood terribly.
I know.
I mean, those houses have been flooding, not just in Matthew, but in everything.
I know they do.
And so I would hope this would be a great opportunity to work on those areas too.
Well, it gives us options we never had before. Again, it gives us space where we can develop storage, and that's been hard to come by.
Yes, John first.
If I could ask a question, I mean, part of what's concerned me is that in all of these discussions, we've been talking about phase one for the Asheville Park, which really helps protect the homes, but still maintains a lot of the street nuisance flooding or whatever else we're gonna call it, but it's still significant impacts. So my question is to you, Tom, does this open up additional opportunities for that second phase to help address the current issues that are being faced by the homeowners in villages A and B?
Well, phase one does a lot for.
I know it does a lot.
For A and B.
But we need to also be honest, it's not gonna do
Most of
everything.
if you want more benefits for A and B, it will be pipe work in A and B. But using this for some large, much more significant storage has big impacts both in the eastern end, but it also has impacts in downstream, because we would, during big storms, we would retain and trap a lot more storage.
Wouldn't have to pump
It
as
does,
much, right?
it does have some benefits in that there are some components of phase two that might not be necessary.
Right.
All right, John.
Yeah, I agree. I thought, you're right on the spot. I thought from the very beginning, one was very short-sighted. We needed a bigger, longer thought. And if you go back and look, and if you take the $8 million of option one and divide it by the number of lots we would be serving, that's about $19,277 an acre before interest. Per lot, excuse me, not acre, per lot. If you add in the lots for D, that brings you up to 455 lots. And when you take about per lot price, goes up to $24,395. So for $5,118 per buildable lot, you get a tremendous amount of capacity that you couldn't buy at $5,000, for that amount of money. So I think really, while it sounds upfront money, this is where you get to be, truly penny wise and pound wise, because it really is the long-term view, and it's worth the upfront money. And plus, then we get to use the sand versus paying for it. When we do the excavation.
differentiation.
Yep, and the time frame is the same, and that's the key. There's no differentiation of construction timelines for these projects. So for the city, it's win. I thought originally it was gonna go to the HOA, but this is even better. So good job, Mr. Mayor.
Becky has something to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one clarification if I could, Mr. Mayor. Just an additional term from the developer would be that the Village D land would be deed restricted as to the use, that it be only for stormwater purposes, the ancillary use of the sand as you're creating that stormwater, or as passive open space, because of course the neighborhood is going to want to keep it unused. So
Do you see that as a problem, Tom?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Just forgot to mention it.
That's perfect.
All right, now, Mr. Hanson, I'm sorry, Rosemary.
So, Tom, the flooding, even with phase one, it's still gonna flood in the streets when there's a really bad storm. Will this do anything more to help alleviate that for villages A and B?
Certainly not in the short run, because we wouldn't be building any more additional storage than what's already in phase one in the short run anyway. As we moved sometime in the future to additional work, we would look at that and see, but really, the big benefit, additional benefit beyond Phase 1 in Villages A and B will be pipe work in Villages A and B.
So that's what's gonna give them the most relief. Is there?
But let me say,
when is that
Phase
going?
1 though, Phase 1, yes, in a 100-year storm, they will have water in their streets, and they might, if a 100-year storm's coming, they're gonna need to pull their cars up in their driveways, which I had to do back in the 60s. We knew enough to do that. But what Phase 1 does is let the water in these lakes get out of the system much, much faster. And what you saw in the past was you'd get these series of storms and just heavy rainfalls that we consider normal around here, and the lake water would just build up and up and up. Then a bigger storm would come and there was no storage. This will improve conditions for frequent, what we call the regular heavy storms we get. So things will be much better. When I say there'll be water in the streets and some flooding, that's in a 100-year storm. A lot of things will get better for more frequent storms.
So Phase 2, what is the timeline of us being able to start on Phase
Well,
2, which is replacing pipes?
Well, there is no funding at this point for that, but as we come back in future years, and I'll give you a little bit of a forecast of things to come, we are going to be bringing you some programs showing you what the city needs to do in terms of getting a handle on stormwater across the city and seawater rise, and they'll be included in all of that. Some of the work, the operations division may be able to tackle on their own if we go in and identify key pipes that would have a lot of bang for the buck. The operations division can use different funding sources to start some of the work there.
There might be some piecemeal work that we could do
Yes, ma'am.
to make, that'll have, like you said, more alleviation of some of the work.
And we'll
Like
do the
Village
pre-design.
A's got the worst.
Right. We'll do the pre-design, and we will prioritize which improvements produce the best benefit.
When will we be working on that?
As soon as an agreement is hammered out and we know exactly what our funding plan is and what our obligations are, then we'll start that.
One
We'll
thought
start that
is
work.
then, if we went with your original recommendation, that extra $3 million could be used to kickstart the next phase.
It could.
For the real problem areas.
But Phase 2 is like $27 million.
No, it's 24, but but there was gonna be $3 million left in that budget account.
Right.
It's only for Asheville Park unless we move it. And I'm not saying that this is, but I was just kind of wondering.
Well, again, that is the trade-off.
Could you have used that for some of these little spot areas to?
Yes, that we could have. The trade-off between Proposal 1 and Proposal 3 as modified by the mayor is the
Long-term effects are
$3 million.
in the long term, it's much more beneficial.
But from a long-term perspective and all the flexibility, it's really the better way to go.
Thank you, I really appreciate that.
All right, and one last question of the staff. I asked the manager to call the developer and get their agreement to this, and you did that, I understand.
Sure I did. I talked to Chris Folger, who went to the podium to address his collaborative initiative to be a part of this at your last meeting, and Chris is amenable to this, and his attorney's over here giving me a vertical nod, so I think we're in good shape if the council seems fit to move to option 3 modified.
John?
Since a number of people might be in their car or might not see this, I think this would be a good synopsis to do out front before the people speak. One, so they can maybe change their perspective, or they may choose not to speak, but it is such a material good news story, I think it would be worthy of sharing up front.
That's a good idea.
So my question to all of you, this amended option is not currently on the agenda, but I would like to put it as an additional option on the agenda.
I think because it's a substitute, you don't have to take a vote if there's a general consensus to substitute it.
But I just want to make sure everybody's okay with it going on the agenda and so forth. Is there?
May I? Okay, the process is what? Okay, we have to come back in August and vote on the
Zoning request.
zoning request,
Right.
which would then be elimination of D lots and transferring any other modifications. And at that time, I guess it's gotten very confusing to the folks out there in peripherals, because I think the very first rezoning back in '04 had maybe 30 proffers or something, and some of those have been changed. And I guess when we see it in August, it will list all of the proffers as they now stand, as well as the plan and everything. Is that where it's all going to be brought together?
I would assume so. I'm looking at Mr. Frankenfield.
So that at that time, everybody will be able to look at it and see what proffers are still in play, what's gone away, what's been modified, everything at that time. That's what we'll have in August. Okay.
All right, well, that's good. We had a nice discussion, and I'm glad everybody agrees to.
Good job, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Okay.
Good job, Lois.
All right, we will now go to city council liaison reports. Any reports?
I went to the last meeting of the Community Development Corporation meeting. It was I'll call it an informal session because they aren't able to meet a quorum with their current board members. But I did go to the meeting. It was a very productive meeting. It was very professionally conducted. They certainly have Second Act is no longer in their building. They're operating. Obviously, they've had to reduce their administrative overhead pretty significantly to live within the boundaries of their budget. I think my take was that they heard a lot of what we asked them to do. I did talk, I don't know if Andy's back here, if he's around. Well, good for him. I think that as we move forward, and we can, because this is the right place to talk about it, it doesn't qualify for executive session. I do think we need to have a good understanding of what the material condition of the 440 properties are going forward. They have about a $1.7 million annual maintenance budget. They have a 15% delinquency rate. I think they're gonna go figure out the root cause of that. They need to do that. But I think going forward, to know that there is a successful way ahead in the revenues is to get an understanding of what the material condition is beyond just the routine maintenance. And that probably would take some A&E investment. I asked Andy to take a look at that. I'm not asking for any permission for anything yet, but what would that cost so that we know what their current cash flow will allow them to be, but are we just maintaining assets at a less than ideal condition? And also, as properties expire and come off their rent issues, we need to maybe relook at their rent flow and how they work that and how they deal with delinquencies, because obviously they can't sustain their system on 15%. So there are some things they want to address, but the thing there today is we really do need to get a sufficient number appointed so that they can actually make decisions as a board, because as of today, that meeting, they could look at their budget, they couldn't adopt it. They could look at these things, but they can't provide any direction. And I think probably that's gotten to the point now where in and of itself, it's creating expenses for them that they would like to control. So that's just an update on that. I know we're going to talk about that later, but I just want to give you what I could tell you in public session where that is. But they are trying to be responsive to what they heard from us. I think that's a fair
Do you have
statement.
any comments on that?
I wasn't at the last meeting, but John and I have spoken offline, and I agree that going forward, we need to appoint some folks to their board in order for them to be able to conduct business as we've asked them to do.
Okay. All right, any other liaisons? If not, city council comments. Jim, you're first.
Got two of them. The first one I'll pass around. If y'all remember during the retreat, we talked about, and Amanda mentioned this to us, and it's been several months ago, talking about the council speaker policy, and one of the things was the people signing up to speak during the meeting. Does everybody have a copy? 20 copies? Okay.
Yeah.
And so what we've got, and this is for next week's agenda, not this week, and Mark's staff put it in, but basically if you go to the last page, under 5.0, registration of speakers, it says no person may register to speak at the meeting once formal meeting has begun. And this dovetails along with, and it's in this agenda request form, it shows that it's identical to the way that the other cities in the region do, where they require the same thing. And so was going to put this on next week, but I just wanted everybody to see it, so. And then I had one other issue, and y'all have been hearing about this, is the compression issue that everybody has heard. What I'd like to do is, so I got a fairly extensive briefing on this Tuesday. I think a lot of the issue, frankly, has been the communication piece of this to the employees. So I'd like to ask, with the council's consent, the manager to hold off on implementation of this compression fix and to set up meetings as soon as practical with public safety chiefs and leaders of the various public safety employee groups so that they can sit down and go over this and ideally bring back a consensus to us. And I've spoken with folks on at the employee level who seem to be agreeable to that. So that's what I'd like to ask the manager to do. It's not a surprise. I mentioned it to the manager earlier, I mentioned it to the deputy city manager and to the mayor. So hopefully everybody would agree to that so we can get it right, since we did put a lot of money towards it. And, we want to make sure that first off, it's done correctly, but also that the employees understand what the process is.
Did you have a comment on this, Jim?
Great idea.
Yeah, I think it's a tremendous idea, and, I've been on council for 14 years now, and we've just been kicking the can on this salary stuff for public safety. And once again, I think it's a disservice to the rank and file people. I agree that, we got to fix the problems at the supervisory level, but rank and file is as essential as anybody that's out there with fire, police, EMS, sheriffs, and everything. And the point is, though, I had a problem with the process where, we get a letter in our packet on Friday and we're due for implementation on Thursday. Once again, kind of rushing things, Dave. This is something that, we avoid a lot of perceptual problems, especially with the rank and file, if we explain things to them first. And, I think going forward, we just got to do a better job at communicating, what we're doing and why. But the point is, I think Jim hit on it. One of our major objectives in this budget cycle, one of the reasons we talked about it at length and compromised, was to get added money into that system. And I just think, this kind of end runs the intention of the council, to be honest with you.
Let me just say, though, just to be fair to what the staff did, they came up with a different type of plan that when combined with two other pieces, in theory, could fix the problem that you've been talking about that's going on for, frankly, a lot more than 14 years. But the problem is, as you said, the communication piece just wasn't there. So I think that's why they need to sit down and go over it and see if there truly is consensus or not. And if there's not, then we start over.
And if I can just follow up on what Jim said, if I believe that, the rank and file, a lot of the other problems are going to be talked about in January. I mean, I think we got to approach the problem as a total problem, requiring a total fix that, that we all can live with. And, the point is, by doing it piecemeal, once again, fixing it one piece at a time, we never know what the budget structure is going to be like and, what limits we're going to have in January. So the point is, let's get it fixed now, at least come to an agreement. But once again, I think we have to be inclusive of communicating, to the men and women that serve our city 24/7 and give them the justice they finally deserve. Thank you.
Jim, did you have another
No,
subject?
those two was the.
All right.
the
Does
speaker
yes, John?
Can I comment on that? I've shared and I'm not going to reveal them here, but I've shared my thoughts both with the mayor and with the city manager. I think that's the appropriate place for them to be shared. But I do think that whatever this communication is, I hope we're in the audience that's being communicated to, because I don't know about you, I read that memo a couple of times and it didn't come across to me what we were really doing. I'm not saying, so whatever this communication is that we're sharing, if you would share it with us as well, because I'd like to understand that. And I've shared with you my thoughts, but I just want to make sure that we're on the receiving end of what this communication is, so we can be smart too.
Yes.
We've added a briefing to your agenda next Tuesday. We've taken an item off and replaced it, and Mr. Cover and the chiefs are all coming in. They're gonna provide you this solution set that they've been working on since the budget was approved and we were turned loose to figure out by the 30th of June what would be a solution that will last in perpetuity with regards to making sure that these newly promoted supervisors whose salaries aren't covering down on those that they're supervising, we've got a solution that works going forward, and that we don't have to deal with the eaches of various and fluctuating salaries of senior subordinates. And we think that it is a sizable investment on the part of the council to reinforce their efforts to want to pursue promotion, to compete for fire captaincy, to compete for police sergeant positions, to take positions of leadership. And we think those salaries, I think the chiefs will be compelling, and we will communicate with you from the podium and in the body. We will also, as the mayor and the vice mayor requested earlier today, to meet with the association groups and to better explain them. Our breakdown was we wanted to communicate with you. We could have delayed the date start until we can get through the process. They didn't want to get out ahead of you, but unfortunately we didn't get our communications put together, and I'll take that hit. I think over the next week they'll make those moves, and probably the week after we brief you, all the members of council, and we'll work through making sure that the rank and file is understanding what we're trying to do here. I think they are conditioned to receiving huge bonus checks based on, $1 above some extraordinarily senior skill identified certified member of and they expect that once they're promoted that they would receive that dollar above them when they don't even have the skill identifier. I think there's a phase-in approach. Guys like me who became first lieutenant company commanders on the East German border during the Cold War had first sergeants that made more than I did because that crusty old guy was there to make sure that young pup first lieutenant company commanders like myself weren't going to get us all in trouble. But within 4 years, I had a senior pay than he had, but I had to earn my stripes and my ability as a leader. And I'm very pleased with the way the chiefs took this on. We had a lot of help from HR and looking at other pay systems. And so we will present that briefing to you, and we will be providing to you in your Friday packet a by-line item listing of what those increases will be per position in the public safety arena. I will not release the names of those individuals, kind of keep that confidentiality, but I will be in possession of those, and both Chief Cover, or Deputy City Manager Cover, and myself, plus the individual chiefs will have those by name listings. So if those conversations come up and you want the specificity for a constituent, we will be available to provide those for you.
All right, anybody else comments? No other comments? All right. We will now go to the informal session.
Well, agenda review.
Excuse me.
On the dot.
Okay, under ordinances and resolutions, we have speakers on item 4. Does anybody have any issues with any of the other items? Everything's okay for consent?
Item 1 is a very good idea.
Yeah, if I could say something about it
Sure, please.
out there, maybe.
Oh,
or-
you mean at the council?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll be brief.
Do you want us to hear, or do you want us to, you just want to make a comment?
I'd just like to make a comment unless there's a speaker.
Okay. All right, then under planning, item 1, we have speakers, and item 3, we have speakers. So we have item 2, City of Virginia Beach for special exemption for alternative compliance, Build 2 requirement in Oceanfront Resort District form-based code, south of 19th Street and the east of North Bird Neck Road, extending south to 17th Street and east just beyond Parks Avenue Sports Center, District 6 Beach.
Consent?
I'm asking.
Yeah.
Please, consent.
Everybody okay?
May I back up to one? All right, so what are we doing? This is the modifications, don't we just need to defer that? Because that's
No,
what,
no, we're gonna pass it.
we're gonna pass it, but I thought we were going to have to,
Remember this whole idea, this whole
I
structure
thought
was,
that's what we had to do was,
I think if I heard this correctly from,
we're going to,
let me roll my thing back, what I thought I said last week anyway,
A
was
resolution.
that we're doing a resolution because the resolution is codifying the direction to the staff to bring us back the things you talked about, which we're gonna vote on. And that allows us, because we've given the direction, but just not codified it per statute, allows us to approve the agreement so we can have that behind us. So you are in effect, it's the only way to get there
Yeah.
and not have these people come back down here again, which I do not
that's on
want.
four.
So we're talking about the top planning item, right? Number one
Yes.
planning
All
item?
right, we're doing the resolution over on the ordinances.
Right.
Now, what are we doing with this top planning item?
A separate resolution.
I think that would be a motion to defer until your first
Right,
voting
yeah, that's
meeting in
what I said.
August.
So we're deferring that
If
to
that's the
August.
course the council chooses on the,
Right.
on the
Defer
ordinance.
that to August, because then it's gonna come back and we're gonna.
And all the
so we
proffers
have
will then be in it.
speakers. So these speakers on this item, what do we tell them?
We need, yeah, I think we need to make it very clear, John's idea for the resolution to direct that is effectively.
Yeah, that's what the resolution, I believe, that's what we tried to put into the
I think
resolution.
what Barbara's
yeah.
trying to think for the people out in the audience, before we call the people up, what I think Barbara's trying to, is having some, probably the mayor or
Right,
someone,
let 'em know
or
what it is,
Barbara,
yeah.
to explain the process so they know, we know, but they're out there, they don't know.
Doing it
Well,
in an ordinance?
Louis, like.
So they understand it's not a deferral,
It's really,
vote on
it's just a technical
You do the
technicality
briefing
that has to
before.
be
Yeah, we're
deferred and can't be
acting on
voted
it
on.
over here.
Correct,
And so we are acting tonight.
Correct.
And this has to be done separately.
correct.
Well, I understood that you were going to have Mr. Leahy do the same briefing out there that he did in here. And then if a member of council, I don't think it's necessarily appropriate for staff to do it, but if a member of council said, here's how this is proposed to work, so that speakers can understand what we're doing,
yes.
then I think that's perfectly appropriate.
And then that'll carry over to planning.
Can we get that added to a PowerPoint then? Can we get this alternative one added to the PowerPoint so people can see it, not just hear us read it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at
Is
Mr.
us?
Leahy.
Can you get that done between now and the formal session, Tom?
And
Okay.
they, listen, the neighborhood, they all love Tom Leahy. They trust him, they believe in him. He has been accessible even on a Saturday afternoon. And with him doing this presentation and giving them all those insurance is gonna make them feel really good.
That's why I dubbed him the secret weapon. back in 19
He is the secret weapon.
And so we're gonna do that in ordinances before item number 4.
Yeah.
All right, good. Check.
Okay, let's see. We need to do that before what?
Item 4.
On your ordinances and resolutions, you've got your cost participation proposals, which is the pitch that Tom gave you. He won't elaborate too much on 1 and 2. He'll just get to the chase on 3, but he'll have that up on the board and everybody will see those. And he'll explain what the proposal 3 modified is. And then from the chair, I assume you would address that the process by which you all are operating today, that if that passes, we will work on the cost participation agreement, and that the planning item, numbering's kind of crazy on my piece of paper here, but I-1 is really going to become a deferral until the first August meeting. And that way, probably some speakers will go
And John's gonna jump in there and tell them what that means, that this is not an effective deferral of making a decision. This is a
decision.
technical deferral because of,
Statutory compliance for
Correct.
notification requirements.
correct.
They were really teaming up with you.
Must be a full moon or something.
I'm buying the lottery ticket.
I hope it does.
Did you do the planning item?
Cool you down, Pam?
Short-term rentals are being denying those. Because we're
Well,
getting
we're
those.
hearing
We
it.
have speakers.
We have speakers, we'll
We
hear
have
it.
speakers. Yeah.
And then that's it, right?
So we're ready for the call.
All right.
That's what I gotta do, yes.
Now,
Don't go, Rosemary.
the chair will entertain a motion to recess into a closed session pursuant to the exemptions from open meetings allowed by section 2.2-3711A Code of Virginia as amended for the following purposes: publicly held property, discussion or consideration of the acquisition of real property for public purpose, or of the disposition of publicly held property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body pursuant to section 2.2-3711A3, Princess Anne District. Public contract, discussion of the award of a public contract involving the expenditure of public funds and discussion of the terms or scope of such contract where discussion in an open session would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body pursuant to section 2.2-3711A29, Virginia Beach Community Development Corporation. Legal matters, consultation with legal counsel and briefing by staff members or consultants pertaining to actual or probable litigation where such consultation or briefing in an open meeting would adversely affect the negotiating or litigating posture of the public body, and consultation with legal counsel employed or retained by a public body regarding specific legal matters requiring the provision of legal advice by such counsel pursuant to section 2.2-3711A7, internal EEO investigation. Personnel matters, discussion, consideration, or interviews of prospective candidates for employment, assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, salaries, disciplining, or resignation of specific public officers, appointees, or employees of any public body pursuant to section 2.2-3711A1. Council appointments, council, boards, commissions, committees, authorities, agencies, and appointees, and appointee evaluations. May I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Call the roll, please.
Ms. Kinley?
Aye.
Mr. Dyer?
Aye.
Mr. Moss?
Aye.
Mr. Davenport?
Aye.
Ms. Abbott's absent. Ms. Kane?
Aye.
Mr. Ern?
Aye.
Ms. Wilson?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Wood?
Aye.
Mayor Kennedy?
Aye.
All in favor.